and anti-Semitism at universities. So we got together in March of last year, and our first directive really was to create a survey for students. So my role in this was I led the design of the survey and also the data collection and data analysis. So I'm going to present that to you today. And my colleague, Karen, was involved in the recommendations and the drafting of the report, which is going to be published in the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. So we're going to present side by side. So I'm sure that you've heard of the increase in anti-Semitism at universities, which has obviously been newsworthy, both in the US and the UK. And we also know that this anti-Semitism has really a profound effect on students' mental health, their studies, and their well-being more generally. So it's very detrimental to students. So the survey that I'm going to talk to you about today, we really structured it around a hypothesis by Feingold. And he is really interested in why is there so much anti-Semitism on university campuses in comparison to other venues, other places. And he proposed this theory which says that there's really four criteria that makes anti-Semitism more likely on university campuses, and he really focused on the US. So he said one is opportunity. So campuses that have more Jewish students are more likely to experience anti-Semitism. That was his hypothesis. Another is stimuli. So that's some sort of event that then causes an increase in anti-Semitism. I have to put on my glasses for a minute. The other one is organization, and so that is having organizations on campus that are anti-Semitic in their own right. And then the last one is distinguishability, and that's the idea that Jewish students might be more distinguishable than other students, not only for Jewish garb that they might wear, but also when they're going to synagogue or they're going to Jewish campus events. So this is the hypothesis, so we're interested to see for the UK as well. So we have 4 research questions that we focused on in the survey. And we first were interested in whether students' experiences of anti-Semitism changed between before October 7th and after October 7th. Obviously, this was a cross-sectional study, so we just had to ask them about their experiences before in the same survey. We were interested in what factors were associated with students' experiences of anti-Semitism. And we structured that around Feingold's hypothesis. So we looked at factors for distinguishability. We looked at factors like, did they wear Jewish symbols, and were they involved in Jewish organizations? For opportunity, we looked at the size of the Jewish population in the university. And obviously we had the event, the stimuli, which was the October 7th. And we also looked at opportunity, and then we also looked at other factors like demographic variables to see whether that had an impact on anti-Semitism. And lastly, we looked at whether students were involved in the JSOC and those types of organization. That's a student organization. Then we were interested in, well, what does the impact of personally experiencing anti-Semitism or witnessing anti-Semitism, how does that relate to their well-being and their studies? And lastly, we really wanted to understand students' own lived experiences. So we wanted to hear in students' own voices what they experienced. So we had a lot of open-ended questions that students could also choose to answer. So we conducted this survey between May 29th and July 3rd, 2024. And basically how we did this is we sent an MS Teams survey link, and we sent this along Jewish University groups. So this was sent on WhatsApp. It was also placed on relevant websites, for example, the Union of Jewish Students. And we basically asked the students if they identified as Jewish, so they had to self-identify as Jewish, and they attended a UK university during the academic year of 2023 to 24. So we really had a very surprisingly more than 500 students that participated in that very short window. And it just goes to show you how much students really wanted to relay what they had experienced in the last year. We had a few students, participants we removed because they were duplicates or they didn't finish the survey, or they seemed that maybe they were not real participants. They might have been bots or something like that. So we really had a fantastic mix in terms of nationality, pretty equal in terms of males and females, and some non-binary students. We also had undergraduate students and about a quarter postgraduate students. And out of the 142 universities in the UK, we had 84 universities who drew responses to the survey. So that's a pretty good sample. These are the measures that we used. These are the ones that really were considered our outcomes. So we looked at things like whether they personally experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism, and that was a count of the different types of anti-Semitism that they could experience. We were also interested in whether they were avoiding places or spaces due to anti-Semitism, and again, that was a count. And the reason that we chose those two measures is because they were parallel to other surveys that had been done in the past. So we could see, well, what was the changes over time if we look at this 2001 survey in the UK or the survey that had happened in the US. We were also interested in whether they had concerns about anti-Semitism and whether they had a negative impact of anti-Semitism on their well-being and their own studies. And lastly, we were interested, it's kind of cut off there, but we were interested in whether they felt that they received university support. So whether there was somebody at the university they could speak to and whether they were satisfied with that support. So in terms of their experiences of anti-Semitism, we found that there really was a very high number of students that experienced anti-Semitism. So 70% reported that they were, let me just see if that's, okay, I'm gonna just go from this one first. They reported that actually there was a very high increase in their experiences of anti-Semitism. So you could see that we found about 80% of the students had either personally witnessed or experienced anti-Semitism after October 7th. And that's a big increase from around, I think it's around 20% before October 7th. And then just in terms of their experiences, a lot of students most students felt very uncomfortable being open about their Jewish identity. And so they would, for example, not wear Jewish symbols or not talk about their Jewish identity. 81% also reported avoiding at least one person or space due to anti-Semitism. So maybe they didn't go to class, or they didn't go to the quad, or they didn't go to spaces where they knew that they would encounter anti-Semitism. And of those who reported avoiding anti-Semitism, they avoided at least 3 different people or spaces. So they avoided quite a lot on average. Students really felt very concerned about anti-Semitism. So on a scale of 1 to 5, the average was 4. And they also felt that they negatively affected their well-being. So 40% said that it affected their well-being at the very highest end. And then another, I think it's cut off a little bit, but I think it was about another 30% felt that they at the next level. So there's quite a lot of students, about 70% of students felt that it had a very big impact on their well-being. Okay, I might put on my glasses for this one. It's a bit far away. Okay, so what about the factors that were associated with experiencing or witnessing anti-Semitism? So we actually found that students who were more likely to organize or attend Jewish events were more likely to experience anti-Semitism. And also another big factor in anti-Semitism was their experience of university support. So if they felt that they weren't experiencing university support, they were more likely to report having experienced anti-Semitism, and also that their university was not serious about anti-Semitism. So it really highlights the impact of the university on their experiences of anti-Semitism. What about factors that were associated with negative effects of anti-Semitism? So we found that female and Israeli students were more likely to have negative effects of anti-Semitism on their well-being or studies compared to male or British students. Students who wore Jewish symbols compared to those who never wore them were more likely to experience negative effects of anti-Semitism. And again, we see this factor about the university. So really experiencing less support from the university and feeling their university was less serious also were more likely to have negative effects of anti-Semitism on their well-being. So when we looked at the association between anti-Semitism and student outcomes, and I should mention that these are all conducted using multiple regression. So all of these variables have independent effects. So they're controlling for all the other variables. So obviously if we looked at just correlations, then all of these variables would be correlated. But this is controlling for all of the different variables that I mentioned before. So really these are having profound and significant effects, controlling for all of the other demographic and predictor variables. So if we looked at this anti-Semitism and student outcomes, we did find that students who personally experienced and witnessed more anti-Semitism incidents, more anti-Semitic incidents, were more likely to avoid people in spaces, have more concerns about anti-Semitism, feel less safe on campus, and experience more negative effects of anti-Semitism. So it's not surprising, this outcome, but it just shows us that really anti-Semitic incidents have a big, profound effect on student outcomes. So I thought it was really interesting in the survey is that we had a lot of students who wrote really, really long open-ended responses here. They really had something to say and they wanted to express it. And it was really heart-wrenching to read all of these responses and quite depressing, to be honest. But it really showed that these students had really experienced really negative impact of anti-Semitism. So we had several open-ended questions. We had 4 different open-ended questions, and we decided to analyze these all together using thematic analysis because really they were all related to students' experiences. So we had a total of 669 open-ended responses across the 500 students. And from these, we had 10 key themes that were generated. And this was a group of 3 people that worked together, including myself, in order to do these thematic analysis. And we also did second coding to ensure that there was reliability. So these 10 themes include avoidance of people and spaces. So again, that's just supporting the quantitative result that we found. And we just found that people, young people were not going to study in the library. They were not going to class. They really curtailed their experiences at university, and some of them avoided, going altogether. And that's really reflected in the withdrawal from campus, the second theme. And we found that some students just didn't go to school, and some actually dropped out of their program because it was so bad with anti-Semitism. Social exclusion was also a devastating theme. And we found that people really lost friendships with others. They felt excluded from their housemates. They were excluded from WhatsApp groups. So they had a real sense of social exclusion. Identity was something that was also impacted. So we did find that people wouldn't say they were Jewish because they were scared. On the other hand, we did find other people that their Jewish identity was impacted in a way that they felt more positive about their Jewish identity and more likely to wear Jewish symbols just to be defiant. So it really went from their education. So when they were in classes, they decided, lecturers sometimes would talk about the war or other issues, and they felt that they were pinpointed out, and they felt that they were excluded from educational opportunities. Another interesting theme was this confrontation of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. And we did find that some students who identified as anti-Zionist didn't like the fact that we were talking about these two together. So there was a small minority of people who did answer this survey and felt that that was something that was salient to them. So it's important to just relate that actually just shows that we had a wide variety of students that answered this survey and had different views on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In terms of hate speech, a lot of students felt that they experienced hate speech, and they gave examples of that. Hate crime, they had examples where they had to get the police involved, they were stalked, they had things stolen. Some of them had physical attacks. Institutional apathy, then this was again reflected in the university support, where they felt that the university didn't take their experiences or worries seriously, and compromised mental health. And again, that was really highlighting the impact that this had on their mental health and well-being. So just to talk about Feingold's hypothesis, so we definitely found that this distinguishability was a factor in campus anti-Semitism. So students who were more likely to organize or attend Jewish events were more likely to experience anti-Semitism. And opportunity, interestingly, in contrast to universities in the US, we actually found the opposite effect. So we found that students who were at university with larger Jewish populations were less likely to experience anti-Semitism. So there was sort of a safeties in numbers effect here in the UK, and that other studies have also found that. So there's a bit of a difference between the US and the UK. And possibly that's because I think in the UK, students are more likely, especially those that are affiliated, are more likely to go to universities that they know are going to be safe, that they know are going to have larger Jewish populations. And we know now that a lot of people are actually choosing their universities based on the university's response to anti-Semitism more recently. So that's something that's here in the UK. Stimuli, so we did find that obviously there was a dramatic rise in experiencing anti-Semitism after October 7th. And organizational, we did not find that that the role of anti-Israel organizations on campus was related to more anti-Semitism, but we did find that it did influence students felt less safe, and they had more concerns about anti-Semitism if they had protests or encampments on university. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and I'll let my colleague Karen go. Are we doing questions at the end? Yeah. Okay, great.
Hello, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Leslie. Yes, so it seems quite odd, I think, to define anti-Semitism at this kind of event where we obviously all have an interest, but at the same time, as Leslie pointed out, there were questions, there were issues that arose within the research that I think means that it's helpful to define our terms clearly before we start. I'm feeling quite short. I'm feeling undermined by my thing. Does it go down? Never mind. I'll tippy toe. Drama 2. We're in drama 2. Let's have some drama. Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. So, in line with other research instruments, mainly among Jewish students in the US, this survey didn't actually present a definition of Zionism or anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism to the survey participants. We just asked them questions about their experiences and focused on manifestations and their experiences from other people, such as through harassment, discrimination, intimidation, exclusion, etc., all the things that Leslie set out. And we asked students about modifications to their own behavior due to anti-Semitism and their perceived effects. So they were free to think of anti-Semitism and indeed anti-Zionism in any way that they saw fit, which, as I said, is in line with other studies and therefore makes sense. And so we also didn't define anti-Zionism, but for the purposes of this and beyond, as I said, it is important to set out our terms clearly. So I think this is where here we go. So according to Schlosser and Ansis, anti-Semitism can be viewed as hostility, discrimination, and or prejudice towards Jewish people as a religious, multiracial, and or ethnic or group or an individual, community, organization, or societal level. So it can be at any level. There is, of course, the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, providing a working definition, and that's been adopted by approximately 44 governments worldwide. And in the UK, it's been adopted by many public institutions, including the majority of universities here. For those of you who perhaps may not be familiar, the definition of the IHRA states that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward the Jewish community, its institutions and religious facilities. And this is actually how we saw it playing out according to the students' own testimony. And again, defining anti-Zionism, this term is perhaps even more contested than defining anti-Semitism. And we draw our understanding of it from the following scholars, among others. So Hirsch and Miller in 2022 defined contemporary anti-Zionism as a movement that puts Jews at the symbolic and material center of all that is most feared and hated in the world. Taking a dialectic approach, Seymour states that anti-Zionism subsumes the anti-Semitisms of the past, just as modern or classic anti-Semitism contained within it earlier pre-modern forms of an anti-Judaic praxis, and is therefore inherently anti-Semitic. And we acknowledge that rarely is anti-Zionism an opposition to actual Zionism, so the self-determination of Jews and the belief that they deserve and are entitled to a state of their own, but rather, as Hirsch in 2023 states, it's an opposition to an imagined Zionism, which manifests as pure, powerful evil in a way that is analogous to anti-Semitism's invention of the Jew. And so taking all of this in mind, we move on to the recommendations from our study. And so I'll start with setting out the rationale for these recommendations. So the scale of the anti-Semitism that university students are experiencing that Leslie earlier so eloquently set out demonstrates the pressing need to address this issue and to design systemic, holistic responses from universities, policymakers, and the higher education sector as a whole. And while some initial and indeed thoughtful responses have been set out and implemented at some institutions, there is a gap and a lack of a coherent, consistent approach. And indeed, we need something more joined up to deal with this problem more holistically. So to that end, a number of recommendations have been offered by a number of different organizations, and they set out to protect Jewish students, as well as free speech and academic freedom, for example. And among them are the Community Security Trust here in the UK, who release their own, well, every other year they release their own research about anti-Semitism in universities, and one came out recording 2024. Then the intercommunal professorial group, of which Leslie and I are members, which funded the data collection and processing of this research. We also produced a report, and so did an organization called Stop Antisemitism, which is based in the US. So all three organizations issued both a kind of overview of what was going on campuses, both in the UK and the US, and a list of a variety of recommendations. And for the purposes of this paper, we've kind of tried to take some common themes from all of those to think about the way forward and how we might begin to tackle this, as I said, in a joined up holistic way across the higher education sector. And so the first recommendation is that a sectoral, oh, I might need to move my slide, sorry, is that a sectoral task force should be created to focus on combating anti-Semitism in universities and higher education. And it should comprise senior leaders from universities, sector-specific bodies and representatives from relevant Jewish staff and student organizations in the UK, such as the Union of Jewish Students and the Jewish Chaplaincy, and there will be similar parallel organizations in the US. The task force aim would be to both continue to conduct research, so the research that's been done and published in 2024 would act as a baseline, and we would continue to collect research, but this research would also broaden out from student experience to staff and faculty experience as well. And to produce guidance on the back of this research that would be adopted by individual universities as well as the overall sector. And we are also proposing that the task force would consider devising a tool to measure universities' progress against tackling anti-Semitism. So a kind of gold standard against which universities could be benchmarked. And as Leslie said earlier, some students and their families are beginning to think about where to apply to based on the extent to which the university has been effective and active in tackling anti-Semitism. And so as a tool that measured this and made the results public would help those students and families to make these decisions. And indeed, perhaps it would encourage universities to do better because universities want students. And we are also advocating that universities should meet and communicate with their Jewish students and staff regularly, in particular when there are specific challenges such as university encampments or other types of rises of anti-Semitic incidents. And this kind of good practice could include things such as open town hall meetings with senior leadership, effective communication for all students with the Students' Union, discussions with elected Jewish societies, and this would be in line with similar models that are adopted for other minority groups on campus, such as disability networks or LGBT networks, etc. And I did want to say something on that, which has now escaped my mind. And universities should also ensure that they have clear, enforceable definitions of anti-Semitism, because just like in this talk and anything we do, especially if we're academics, we define our terms first and foremost. And so universities really need to be clear. And I don't know specifically about the US, but in the UK, the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was contested. Many staff and the union in particular, the UCU, were opposed to the adoption of it. Many universities did adopt it nonetheless, partly due to pressure from the then government, which was the Conservative government, and the Education Secretary at the time, Gavin Williamson, applied pressure. But in fact, this pressure actually made many feel less comfortable with the definition rather than more. The feeling that they were adopting it under duress, and especially as many universities position themselves as being more of the left rather than the right, made this sense of enforcement less comfortable. So while the IHRA is an important definition, it would perhaps be useful for universities and for a kind of cross-sectoral group to adopt a definition, either that definition or another acceptable one willingly, rather than with a sense of enforcement. And however, no matter what the definitions are, they must be included in staff and student codes of conduct and other relevant documents. They need to be part of diversity and inclusion training and awareness for all members of the university community, and clearly communicated to staff in relation to learning spaces, including what constitutes anti-Semitism and staff responsibilities for both avoiding the expression of it themselves, which we have seen here in the UK, and I believe also in the US, where staff have not been backwards in coming forwards in expressing anti-Semitic views and opinions, but also for how to address it when expressed by others in physical and online teaching spaces, because many staff do say that even whether Jewish or non-Jewish, where even when encountered with it and having a willingness to tackle it, they're not quite sure what to do or how to go about that. And so this kind of communication would be very helpful. In addition, accessible and clear, effective reporting procedures must be made available for anyone who's been the victim or witnessed anti-Semitism. And it needs to be clear by signposting what will be done, by whom, at what stage, what anyone reporting it can expect, and of course that they will be free from reprisals for having reported anti-Semitism. And there need to be precise and clear disciplinary processes and procedures set out so that people know what the price is for discriminating against a minority group on campus. And that should be enforced swiftly and visibly. And senior leadership must provide unambiguous communication about encampments, the right to protest peacefully on the one hand, and the right to non-discrimination and non-harassment based on race or religion on the other. And these communications should be made accessible and openly available, and should be quickly and visibly enforced, as I said. And so to conclude, I'm getting my pages all mixed up now, here we go. To conclude, it's evident from the research presented here that when Jewish students have university support, and this is something that Leslie highlighted, when students have university support and perceive that their university takes anti-Semitism seriously, those students have fewer concerns about anti-Semitism. So we can see that there is a direct correlation between universities taking anti-Semitism seriously, acting upon it to protect their students, and students feeling safe and protected on university campuses. And therefore fewer incidents are reported, and there are fewer negative effects on their well-being. And so obviously universities taking this seriously is a key important step forward. And therefore it must now be the goal of all university to follow this model and to demonstrate unambiguous support for Jewish students in the face of anti-Semitism, and a zero tolerance approach towards those, both staff and students alike, who express anti-Semitism. This would start with acknowledging the problem. Universities should set out their understanding of anti-Semitism and of their public duties under the Equality Act 2010 here in the UK to protect Jewish students from harassment and discrimination. Next, universities should implement effective anti-Semitism training and robust report and support systems, alongside mechanisms for swift enforcement of disciplinary action against the perpetrators of anti-Semitism. And in the longer term, universities should leverage research that is important to effectively combat anti-Semitism on university campuses, and they should support further research that should be undertaken to continue to record, to understand, and to monitor the nature of anti-Semitism on our university campuses. And this would be a larger project than the current survey, obviously, and it would be designed to work with all relevant stakeholders and find consistent solutions for protecting Jewish student safety and well-being. And it should also extend to recording and understanding anti-Semitism experienced and witnessed by Jewish university staff, which we have not done in our survey, and recognize that this is an important next step. And in fact, universities, being what they are, can draw on their own research capacity to make more data-informed decisions about responding to anti-Semitism. So they can fund research to help them to understand what's going on, and this could be also directed specifically at their own universities to continue to monitor and work out what is going on, whether the steps they've taken have been impactful, and how to continue to proceed. And I am well within my time. Thank you.
We now come to a presentation from Alexander Tsesis from Florida joining us, and I think this is about the context of the United States, but also about free speech and how that goes into that.
Yes, Alexander Tsesis, Florida State University College of Law. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for the Jewish Community Center of London, and particularly Anna Zawadzka for organizing this. University authorities face a twofold dilemma of operating institutions that are committed to free speech and are obligated by U.S. law to investigate and address claims of hostile environment. Those who administer young adults' educational experience must walk a tightrope of providing opportunities to discuss controversial issues while stimulating and remaining vigilant to prevent the debate deteriorating into harassment. Assessment of whether public universities have an obligation to restrict anti-Semitic communication should reflect on several overlapping, sometimes contradictory constitutional, statutory, and regulatory interests. Principally, the controversy about legitimacy of such restrictions invokes concern about free speech on campus. Equal participation and dialogue requires protections of various voices that engage in civil exchange of ideas, some of which will be uncomfortable for some members of the academic community. For the ideal of intellectual agora, or the marketplace of ideas, to exist, so long as students feel comfortable to voice their opinions. However, intimidating tactics, such as those that prevent Zionists from joining campus organizations, such as occurred on the UC Berkeley campus, UCLA, and Columbia, stifle ideas. Exclusionary student practices are a sign of a growing intolerance of Jewish sensibilities and an adoption of a double standard that dismisses concerns about animus directed at persons who espouse Jewish causes or speak out against anti-Semitic intimidation and verbal attacks. In the wake of the October 7th terror attack, college campuses throughout the United States witnessed a growth of anti-Semitism. Protesters relied on aggressive verbal tactics in places as broad as the Northeast, in Middlebury University, located in Vermont, Cornell University, located in Ithaca, in the Southwest in UCLA, 5 miles north of there in Berkeley, 5 hours north of there in UC Berkeley. And all this while deadly conflicts were simultaneously occurring throughout the world, in the Ukraine, in Congo, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, Sudan, Turkey, Syria, Myanmar, and Tibet. And we saw absolutely no protests against about any of them. Student protests often adopted Hamas's slogans, repeating them and defending the use of violent struggle, intifada, to achieve political ends. Some of the chants even adopted Hamas's actual words from their charter, from the 2011 charter. There are too many incidents to recount, but here are some of them. In Cornell and Columbia, Jews were equated with pigs and rats. At Cooper Union, Jewish students barricaded themselves from a mob in a library. In the aftermath of the October 7th pogrom, universities often refused to address and overt anti-Semitic slogans in campus, including Jews back to Poland, Zionists die, from the river to the sea, and globalize intifada. These were not discursive, but intimidating slogans to the point of denigrating university education. The serious harassment on U.S. college campuses were well orchestrated to create broad disruptions. The riots in 10 cities impeded the education of students, many of whom felt too intimidated to walk in various parts of campuses in order to engage in learning and discourse. There is reason for grave concern given the millennial history of anti-Semitic speech morphing into violent acts. I discussed in my first book, Destructive Messages, and in a variety of articles, how anti-Semitic statements can morph and grow in order to, from slogans into actual incitement. For example, in Germany, widely accepted tropes of Jews supposed to be demonic powers, conniving natures, destructive aims, and harmful intents led to pogroms and attempted extermination. Anti-Semitic speakers inflamed hostile audiences and spurred them to commit property damages, rapine, sexual assaults, and genocidal murder. The educational setting is a special one because it thrives on open discourse. Universities, however, have not always been safe havens. And here I'm thinking of a variety of spaces because oftentimes it's completely downplayed as these are just students, they have very little effect. I'm thinking here of the Red Guard in China with their persecutorial methods against academics and against the Chinese population in general. Obviously, fencing clubs in Germany, where Jews were excluded in university campuses at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, and of course, KAMI, which is a joint action front of Indonesian university students in Indonesia that led extreme violence on campuses and beyond. After October 7th, college administrators dragged their feet before quelling the riotous behavior on U.S. campuses. As a result, universities lost control of classrooms and open spaces on campuses. That inaction was consistent with a decades-old pattern on U.S. campuses to ignore Jewish students' complaints and treat them as suspect and unwarranted. While the complaints brought by other ethnic and minority and religious groups were investigated and condemned pretty consistently. In light of the university's initial unwillingness to address violent chants on campus, Senator Charles Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, correctly asserted that after the 7th of October, Jewish Americans are feeling singled out, targeted, and isolated. The lack of even-handedness is partly attributable to the increasing popularity in the United States of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movements. The ideological framing of that school of thought includes Jews as a set of vulnerable, excludes Jews from the vulnerable group of individuals whom they consider to be minorities, which typically constricts the definition of minority to people of color, and therefore completely excludes Jews from that definition, defining away the history of the millennial history of anti-Semitism. For example, at Stanford University, the DI program director responded to Jewish participants who asked for investigations on campuses by telling them the Jews possessed privilege and power, and therefore there was no need to engage in any further attention to their complaints. At Yale University, a DEI speaker who spoke before the Yale Law Journal, after a non-Jew asked questions of why is the only group you haven't mentioned Jews, said that she first of all refused to answer, and then she said, well, I'm willing to consider Jews as a minority group as long as it's a Jew of color, which pretty much excludes all of us, I mean, unless we're all people of color. The concerns of Jewish students and their allies were not only initially downplayed by university administrators, but also by libertarian scholars and well-known ones such as Professor Eugene Volokh and Howard Wasserman, who argued that even calls of genocide, absent imminent threats of violence, were contextually protected statements. These pundits wrote columns on popular blogs that defended university presidents of Harvard and MIT for their unwillingness to unequivocally state that student protesters' calls for genocide of Jews would violate the university's policies of harassment. I want to turn to United States Supreme Court doctrine briefly. In addition to federal statutory obligations, many universities have adopted campus codes. These written standards for student conduct safeguard the ideals of free speech, including self-assertion, self-government, and informational acquisition. Universities commit their communities to the dissemination of knowledge and the development of politically conscious citizenry. Disputes are inevitable on campus because research on subjects and discussions are often some of the most contentious political, cultural, historical, and sociological subjects. The difficulty for college administrators is how to ascertain where passionate statements about policies or politics uh, morph into verbal and physical harassment. While simple discomfort of speakers' views is insufficient to suppress controversial statements, threatening, intimidating, and harassing statements are inconsistent with the development of young leaders into conversationalists, researchers, professionals, and model citizens. And this is a very brief overview of U.S. Supreme Court cases that are pertinent. One of them is the most famous, of course, is the development of the incitement doctrine at the beginning of the 20th century, which arose from the clear and present danger test in a case from after World War I, but has now become the current test for incitement from Brandenburg, a case that many of you will be familiar, that requires that the speech be permitted even if it's extremely inflammatory, unless it is directed at inciting imminent lawless action and likely to incite and produce such action. While there's no scienter element, no mental element in there, the court has in later cases found that it's necessary to prove that there was intent so to incite to imminent lawless action. But there's an alternative doctrine, and one that's most people don't mention, which is very interesting because even when I go to European events, or certainly in the U.S., that is typically limited to Brandenburg, that test that I just mentioned, which is almost impossible to prove, and therefore just kind of lets people say as they want, and perhaps for good reason, because we certainly don't want to suppress speech, and even when it's inflammatory, and certainly not when it's hyperbolic and when it's just meant to be a joke. But there's another doctrine, something called the true threats doctrine. The true threats doctrine, which is rarely discussed in this context, does not require imminence, and it doesn't necessarily require purpose. There is an intent element, but it's intent as it's defined by the Model Penal Code. That is to say, it includes recklessness, a knowledge as well, which are two lower level standards of proof, and prohibit people from truly threatening individuals or specific groups. Another alternative, and one that's been mentioned much more commonly in the methodology that should spring out of the continued incitement on campus, although I've been writing about anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses for over a decade, so this is not something new, even though it's been discussed as new, and you rarely hear news about what was going on before this. But the other one is time, place, and manner restrictions, which would limit certain places such as the quad, where people have to walk through, or sidewalks, certainly classrooms, and the front steps of university buildings from protests, which limit the ability of students to enter and to continue on in their education. The one that is now being looked at and has been discussed quite often now by universities that are developing codes such as Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford is a statute called Title VI. It comes out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is something that creates a personal cause of action only if there's an intent, which is very, very difficult to prove. But it allows for disparate impact. That is to say, if there is a disparate impact, a negative impact on Jewish students, allows for the Department of Education, United States Department of Education, to act against universities specifically. In other words, they do not need to prove intent, that the university was intentionally discriminating, but it's enough to have the effect. This is Title VI, as I mentioned. Congress passed this law pursuant to its spending clause. So you might say, well, why doesn't it have to do with free speech in the First Amendment? Because it's the spending clause. So the government says, we will give you money, universities. You've heard of this, taking away 400 million from Columbia. We'll give you a certain amount of grants as long as you maintain certain environment on campus conducive to education. And this grants the federal government the prerogative of whom to distribute the federal funds to. The statute, interestingly, prohibits recipients from receiving government largesse only in circumstances. Think of this, the context, 1964, in the context of race, color, and national origin. So we might just put it more simply: racism and xenophobia. That'd be the way to use more common words for it. The determination of whether speech is protected or a form of harassment can only be made on a case-by-case basis that involves complex trade-offs between campus safety, educational needs, and self-expression. In order to analyze whether there is a hostile environment that violates Title VI, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights requires the following: a hostile environment based on race, color, and national origin. The school had actual or constructive notice of the hostile environment. The school failed to take prompt and effective steps that were reasonably calculated to end the harassment, eliminate any hostile environment and its effects, and to prevent the harassment from recurring. This test provides steps to determine whether students' educational opportunities were limited because of race, color, national origin, and then when I add something here, shared ancestry and ethnic characteristics. The Biden administration in 2024 promulgated a Dear Colleague letter, which has the effect of law, even though it sounds like it's a letter, it does have the effect of law, that found that Title VI extends discrimination based on shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. The letter lists the following protected ethnic characteristics. Remember, the statute in and of itself is race, color, or national origin. But the Biden administration's letter included Jews, Israelis, Muslims, Sikhs, Palestinians, and others. Jewishness is therefore incorporated into Title VI, although not explicitly mentioned in the text of the law, albeit OCR's, that the Office of Civil Rights characterization, might be challenged in court. Many of the pro-Hamas rallies on campus in the wake of the October 7th fit this rubric. In my mind, groups who support anti-Semitism should not be funded by general student funds, nor should they be allowed to reserve university spaces. Otherwise, we will have campuses where Jewish students will be severely harassed with equanimity. Moreover, we're always going to be the minority, except in some very, very few universities. Moreover, it strikes me that groups should lose their funding for excluding those who hold Zionist views, which has the heaviest impact on Jewish students. On the other hand, the Trump administration's pursuit of Mahmoud Khalil, which of course has been the news, seems to me to have gone overboard. Although the facts remain unclear, he seems not to have been charged with any crime. The arrest seemed consistent with the Trump administration's general efforts to remove undesirable people. Permanent residents are persons whose speech is protected to the same degree as those of U.S. citizens. And in order to remove him, the Trump administration would need to prove that he committed a crime of moral turpitude, not just a crime, but a crime of moral turpitude. At this point, I'm not even sure he participated in the planning of the Hamilton Hall takeover at Columbia. I haven't seen evidence, maybe it's forthcoming. I have yet to even see quotes from him. I'm not entirely sure what he stands for other than his letter. It's also unlikely that criminal trespass, if it can be proved that he in fact criminally trespassed on Hamilton Hall, is a crime of moral turpitude. I found no case law in the state of New York indicating that criminal trespass is a crime of moral turpitude. And the two jurisdictions I found related to that, which is Georgia and Texas, found that, in fact, criminal trespass is not a crime of moral turpitude, which is necessary for the purposes of removal. Without a conviction, moreover, on something that is a crime of moral turpitude, the material support for a terror statute would also not apply, since it requires coordination with a designated foreign terrorist organization like Hamas. And perhaps the information is going to come out, and if it does, then that would create a legitimacy for this arrest. So the First Amendment principles are methods of protecting even, very strongly worded expressions that are highly offensive, but not ones that harass and impede the educational environment. And the horrible thing is that on U.S. campuses, this has been a major problem, particularly from 2023, 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you also. Good 20 minutes for discussions. Karen Nelson, he used this term psychological safety. That is, he distinguished that from feeling of challenge and even discomfort that universities are usually a place. There are exchange of ideas, telling new ideas. But psychological safety might be a term that we want to achieve also in the British context and in the American context, where we can even use that as a distinction of what is then free speech and what should not be allowed. So maybe I just use my role as chair to put this question to both of you if you think that would be a useful term, and then we open it up to all people in the room. But would that be something, because you did the study on the experience of Jewish students, so is that something that could be used as a category that universities can say, well, the students have to feel kind of protected in a way that they feel safe in their identity, psychologically, but of course they need to be challenged with ideas.
Concept, because it's used a lot in organizational well-being, thinking about the workplace. And the workplace has a specific goal, and that is to make sure they are innovative and they have creative ideas, but people are able to express that. So the idea that a growth mindset is, which is that you can make mistakes and you can challenge ideas, and that it doesn't have any reflection on your own abilities. I think that's a good concept for the classroom, and it's one to consider. Whether how it works outside the classroom is another idea, because it really has to do with people talking to each other and feeling able to express different ideas in a way that's safe. So that is something that we can measure in the classroom, and you could set up, usually when they want to have psychological safety in an organization, they set up certain rules, and the leader has to also explicitly show those rules. So it has to be that the employees can challenge the leader themselves. So whether lecturers feel comfortable doing that would be another thing. So I think it is about training lecturers in the classroom. It is about establishing rules and making their seen to. So it's something that could be applied. In my own work, we did a very interesting study this year where we taught positive psychological concepts. And one of those was psychological safety in a Spanish class, just to see if it influenced their well-being. So it could be something that's incorporated into more classes based on whatever subject they're doing.
So I think quite a bit of research has been done on the challenges in the contemporary university, where feelings often take precedence over reality. So students who feel unsafe but are in fact not unsafe. And there's been a recent case in the UK where Professor Kathleen Stock has recently somewhat been vindicated in that she was hounded off her campus for holding views that sex is immutable, and she was hounded off for being transphobic. And it has been found by the Office of Students that the behavior towards her and the lack of protection by the university for legitimate views, which do not actually cause any form of unsafety, is unlawful, and the university has been fined significantly for not protecting her and not protecting free speech. And I think this is a really interesting case where students claim they felt unsafe due to these views, but in fact, feelings do not reality make. Whereas what we have happening with Jewish students in this instance is that those feelings are borne out. Feelings of unsafety are borne out in reality, with women receiving death and rape threats, men being physically assaulted, people being actually excluded from participating in study groups, in social activities. And so I think that's also, so psychological safety is important. And we do obviously have to protect the students' perceived well-being. And I think there is a difference between that and actual reality-based physical well-being and threat and inclusion or exclusion. And it does make this conversation, this conversation is complex. And even though we provided a list of recommendations, we're not beyond recognizing that they are not straightforward. So I agree with Leslie. I would definitely want to consider this idea of psychological safety, but I think it's about parameters and definitions and application, and also an acknowledgement that to be challenged psychologically or intellectually is wholly important for developing young people into responsible, thoughtful, critical adults. And at the same time, we do have quite clear laws on what is permitted speech and what is incitement to hatred and to violence, and those need to be upheld. They're there for a reason and they are well-founded. And so how you balance enforcing those while encouraging discussion that is civil and challenging is exactly what we're grappling with.
Well, I think that's really well spoken. I am very concerned about this concept of psychological safety. I don't know the work that you're referring to, but to me, it gives rise to the term trigger warning. And there was this whole movement in the United States about avoiding things that would trigger people's concern. So, for example, there was a group of students in Oberlin that tried to prevent teachers from teaching Ovid because there are rape scenes in it. F. Scott Fitzgerald, and there were a variety of things that they wanted to exclude. Huck Finn, there's been a wide movement of trying to exclude it, even though Huck Finn is an anti-discrimination novel. It uses, very a derogatory term. And so this effort to try to prevent people from reading it. And I wonder how really we could teach things, again, using the U.S. term as trigger warning in U.S. law schools, particularly criminal law, if we're concerned about triggering people. I mean, there's all sorts of things which we must teach: sensitivity to domestic violence, where there might be victims in the room; about abortion, or there might be people who gained access to abortion; about rape. These things must be taught. They are taught for the purpose of sensitizing people so that they can deal with these heinous forms of criminality in our society. So I do think, and I think Karen put it really, really well, this distinction between harassment and particularly severe harassment in this area and just feelings, because they're, not to underplay the actuality of emotions, but rather as things that would be active, because, there are people who have feelings about all sorts of things at different levels. I am sometimes asked not to use, for example, the word aliens when it comes to my teaching immigration constitutional law, but that's the term in the statute. That's the term that I use. And so it strikes me that perhaps one way of dealing with this is a way that Dean Robert Post from the Yale Law School has recommended, which is to deal with norms of academic standards. Severe harassment means that people are hounded from classrooms, prevented from education, blocked from entering into halls. There's such loud protests in front of university libraries, such as there was before the University of Michigan and elsewhere, that they can't study, without hearing these horrible slogans like "From the river to the sea," which Palestine will be free of what? Of Jews. Palestine will be free of Jews. That's what Hamas means. So I think that there does certainly need to be a distinction between emotivism and harassment.
Thank you. So, are there questions in the room or comments on this? Do we need to? Yeah, the microphone. The microphone.
Thank you all so much. Very, very articulate and insightful talks. I just wanted to add, I'm a faculty at a medical school, and there have been many medical students in the United States who said that they have felt very much discriminated against in speeches they have heard, the way faculty behaved towards them, comments. They were concerned about repercussions getting into further training programs that in the United States it triggered starting American Jewish Medical Association, where there are faculty acting as points of contact to assist Jewish students, because many have felt that they are deliberately being blocked from further entry into residency and fellowship training programs. And there are a lot of Jewish physicians in the United States and all over the world, but certainly, my concern is that going into the future, there will be less and less because of such practices. And I don't think anyone in this room has a discrete solution for it, but I just wanted to share that it occurs in the medical space as well.
Yeah, like in Australia.
And we also had medical students as well in our survey that experienced discrimination and as well. So that was also in our survey.
Also, to your point about Jewish medical students turning to faculty for support and help, we're absolutely seeing that here across all disciplines, and many of us taken on the role in our universities, whether officially or unofficially, of supporting our Jewish students who feel they have nowhere to turn to. And at the same time, staff are also encountering various examples or experiences of anti-Semitism, both from other students in the classroom and from other staff, and then taking on also the burden of supporting their students. And it's a very complicated picture. And it gets particularly complicated when you think, exactly as you say, that the future doctors, politicians, teachers, police officers, social workers are the people coming through our university systems now. And what are they learning? And what are they being taught is okay? And to take your point, Alex, of norms of academic standards, what is happening to those? Because it's also our future academics who are at university now, and our future academic administrators, which is why it's so important that we address this as a matter of urgency.
And certainly this has been true in other countries where Jews were excluded from certain clubs, and now there was a movement to exclude Jews who were Zionists, right? But given the Jews in the United States, about 92% of Jews in the United States are Zionists, that excludes almost all Jews. So in that case, there are Supreme Court precedents that prohibit such inhibitions on viewpoints in school. So it's a great point. Thank you.
Oh, somebody before me?
No.
Hi, Deborah Greenblatt. I'm at Medgar Evers College, City University of New York. My campus feels great, but the City University of New York is under a Title VI violation, one of the big ones, and we're working against that. We have a couple of concerns, obviously, with what's happening with our federal government and the no longer having the DOE, and where our Title VI complaints or our violations are going to be going. And so I'm interested in that for you. Also, we'll be doing a session next on on using books to talk about Jewish identity and anti-Semitism. And we will be talking about curricular violence. So if people want to hear more about that, that's in the next session. But besides my commercial, my other question had to also do with one of the things, being that we're under Title VI violation, is the ADL in America, right, has a campus climate survey similar to what you're talking about. However, what we're finding is that they're saying, oh, anti-Semitism isn't as bad now in these colleges that are under the violation, like Brooklyn College campus, Baruch campus, like all different campuses. However, as faculty there, we are like, who are they surveying? Like that doesn't feel true to us at all. And so I guess my question, or what I would like to hear your thoughts on that from all the panelists, as to how do we make sure that if we have a survey that is getting a sense of campus climate and anti-Semitism, that we know that what's being reported is accurate. Like, are they surveying the correct people? Are they, it's impossible in my mind that these schools that were getting a grade C last year are getting a grade A this year, when I know from my own research, the things that CUNY says we're doing, we are just on paper. We're actually not doing them. I have an article coming out about that soon. But yeah, so I would love to hear sort of your thoughts on the way you feel that a survey could go that could be effective, or like making sure that it's accurate, and then maybe the thoughts on how, if we do not have a DOE anymore in the United States, how any of these Title VI violations will be addressed.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and difficult as well, because now surveys are so easy to collect. Just putting a link on social media and hoping you get a good response and you get the right people. And we're also reliant on people to have to say that who they are, you know. So I think in our case, because first of all, we did the survey right after October 7th, people were very eager to share their responses, and we also shared it very widely across WhatsApp groups and JSOP, the Jewish Society, and synagogues, and also we shared different religious backgrounds to ensure that we had a representative sample. In the US, what that would look like, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I did go to a university in the US, but I don't know what it looks like now. So that would be interesting to see. Are there Jewish organizations? Maybe it would be to contact things like Hillel, it'd be Jewish sororities and fraternities, maybe to other Jewish organizations, to ensure that you had a wide representative sample. And then to also look at the characteristics of who responded to the survey at each university, to ensure that it had a good sample within that and it was representative of the wider Jewish population. And I think that the other thing is that really now you have to offer incentives, because people will not spend 10 or 15 minutes unless they're getting they're entering a raffle, or they're getting 10 pounds from Amazon or something like that. So I think those are sort of ways that you can ensure that you get a better sample. But you're right, it is a challenge now.
And I think also it's a question of matching your instrument to your population. So in the UK, we are a tiny Jewish community. There's approximately 300,000 Jews in the UK in total. And then students obviously is even less, and they tend to be bunched in certain universities that, many, like I teach at the University of Greenwich, and I think we have one Jewish student at the moment. But there are about 6 Jewish staff because we're in London. And so in the States, it's obviously a different picture, much bigger population and more widely spread out over the universities. But we are, for example, when it comes to surveying staff, thinking about doing interviews rather than survey, because it's staff are experiencing things differently, and they're experiencing things both on behalf of their students as well as on their own behalf. And so we want to think about speaking to them in more depth, and then you are more assured of course, of who is participating, because I would worry that the decline that is being reported by ADL could come from poor data collection.
That's my wonder, if CUNY is deciding who they're surveying so that their letter grade goes up. But I don't know, because the ADL actual thing is fine.
Parents, for example,
Yes.
to encourage their children to participate, their children. So I don't, it's not innocent.
I'll be very quick because there are other questions, and I want to make sure that we get to them. I think it's terrible, this concept that Trump is trying to dismantle the Department of Education. Partly because of the Title VI issue. I absolutely agree with you. They're the ones who typically investigate. The Department of Justice can do it as well. It's in the statute, so I think that would be the way to do it. CUNY is a very troubling case. The law school is horribly troubling because the faculty voted for boycott and divestment, and they had at least 1 year, I think 2 years in a row, where the keynote speaker at the law school was just lambasting everything about Israel and using very anti-Semitic type of tropes, and the faculty just sat on stage and listened. So it is really a troubling case. Thank you.
I saw at least 2 hands up.
This lady here who's had her hand up for
Yes, so 3, right? So can we collect them? Because we only have 5 minutes, so please go ahead, and then we go directly to the other question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm at Goldsmiths College, and I've been supporting students and staff who have been experiencing anti-Semitism on campus. And your results and your comments resonate with me. There's a couple of things, though. One of them is that in my department, I'm in the psychology department, I have not experienced any anti-Semitism. I have only had support all the way through. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge when it is there as well as when it isn't. The other is one of the things in supporting students and staff, I'm in my 60s, right? My version and my understanding of Zionism is very different from the kids that I talk to on campus, whether they're Jewish or not. And one of the things that is bothering me in this space is the importance of dialogue across and an understanding of the other and an understanding of different dimensions of what we mean by Zionism. And when I speak to some of the young people, Jewish young people and Israeli young people, and I hear them and listen to them, they know nothing about what is happening in the West Bank. They know nothing about systematic annexation of the West Bank. So even put Gaza to one side, what we understand and know about what's actually going on with today's Israel, since probably Rabin was shot by Ben-Gvir's mate, we are looking now at an authoritarian state, and an increasingly authoritarian state for those of us that read Haaretz every day with horror. I am not anti-Zionist. However, from where I sit, this space is really important that we understand what's going on. And some of what I hear as anti-Semitism, as an experience of anti-Semitism from Jewish students and staff, and a long way from not all, but some of it is an inner conflict by what we are, in listening to people, is not only an external conflict in terms of anti-Semitism, but also an internal conflict of the horrifying situation that we all find ourselves in today. I'll stop, I promise. I'm talking about some of this tomorrow. I'm going to do my advert thing. But I'm really interested in your comment on that. And in terms of UCL, really interested in what you think about things like Disagreeing Well and the IPI initiative, which seem to me to be excellent initiatives trying to do this work. Thank you.
Right, I'll try to be quick. Thank you very much for interesting talks. A question to Leslie and Karen. First of all, why did you choose not to define your terms, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And I'm very curious about how you framed your questions, and especially if you have, do you have surveys from earlier sort of baselines to compare your results to. I think that's really important when we talk about change, not just ask people if they felt changes over time and so on. My main question is about the little group that you talked about, students who felt that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have been conflated and their problem with that. That's an interesting group, and I wonder if you could say something more about them. How big is this group? What would they say in the open-ended questions and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. A question for Alex on the Khalil case. Can it not be argued that since he was the official spokesperson of the organization that did indeed carry out all these illegal acts, that he could be held legally responsible for those acts? And then second, as a legal alien, is it possible to deport him on grounds, perhaps for citizens, protected speech for legal aliens? I've seen articles case law access, or have been deported for the verbal support of terrorism, which he has clearly done by, among other things, distributing flyers with a Hamas logo. And
thank you very much for these complex questions. These are ongoing debates, obviously, and we in the panel have, like Karen and I discussed the order here. You take the first question, second, and the third, so that works out well, and then we're almost finishing in time. So,
But how much time do we have? Because it's 10:30.
well, it's 10:30,
Till
so we're
10:30.
finishing up.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, because it's 10:30 now.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's maybe 29 or so.
Okay.
So we can try and do this quickly. I'm happy to try and do this in max 4 sentences, if that
Okay,
works.
Yeah.
So thank you for your question. And I think one of the problems with university debate and societal debate at the moment is the erosion of people's ability to hold more than one complicated idea at the same time. And this belief that we can very easily define evil versus good, right versus wrong. So that's my premise in answering your question in the first place. And of course, one can be outraged, as I am, and I'm sure many of you are, by the horrific events and atrocities of October the 7th, and at the same time be appalled by the death and mutilation of babies in any war. Okay? And at the same time, the operations of the State of Israel, whether we agree or disagree with them at any point in time, are not the responsibility of individuals, whether Jews or Israelis or anyone who may or may not support that country at any time. And to argue that Jews' ability to function on campus or indeed in wider society is dependent on the acts of the State of Israel is anti-Semitic by any definition. And so that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just focus on your question, and that is that it was about, I would say about between 15 and 20 students that felt that way. And it was students that I think reflects your comment as well, is that they identified with what was happening in Gaza, and quite a few of them attended the protests and encampments and found it very welcoming. And they even, someone mentioned celebrating a Shabbat there and things like that. So I think it was a group of students who felt ostracized from the Jewish community. They weren't part of the Jewish society, and they felt that they were not getting support and that they wanted it. So that was that kind of view from that group. So, but it was, like I said, a minority of people out of the entire survey.
Thank you. And one sentence to this famous case.
I'll try to be really, really fast, but certainly the question is not about support or not support of the State of Israel, or support or not support of the Netanyahu government currently, but rather whether or not anti-Semitic tropes are being allowed. So even this the IHRA definition differentiates those two things. The problem is, really fast. I was in Washington D.C. I was working at George Washington University. I was walking down the street, and it was that giant rally of 30,000 people. You know who was in the front? Natural Carta. 2 members of it. 2 people dressed in Hasidic dress literally in the front. I came up directly in front of him, straight into that thing, and I said, "You're shaming the Jews," because it's a complete out maneuver, and it's just putting themselves out front and using to try to represent as if there's a dominant trend amongst Jews to support these sorts of movements. As to Khalil, to show that he's a leader, I suppose was there a conspiracy, which would be a criminal action? If he was a leader in fact, he did conspire to invade Hamilton Hall, then it's a criminal trespass. And then the question is it a crime of moral turpitude? In order to be removed, it's not just a crime, it must be a crime of moral turpitude. And as I say, in New York, there's no statute. There is case law in Georgia and Texas, and it is not a crime of moral turpitude, which should not be a removable offense. Besides that, and that is for permanent residents, which he's a permanent resident. Permanent residents have speech rights, as do any at the same level. That I don't think there's any case that differentiates them from citizens. And so he would be free to speak out. There's now a question of whether he lied on his green card, on his permanent resident application. If that's the case, it's a very rare thing to exclude, to remove them I can't think of the word, but to take away their permanent residency status. And it would have to be proven in a court of law that they would be consistent and would not be viewpoint specific, which would be a violation of the First Amendment. So a very troubling case indeed.
Thank you.